CS and Don became very close friends outside of working at Northern Grill. Many nights were spent at the bar, socializing with fellow employees and the manager on duty. CS was going through a terrible breakup at the time, and Don instantly was retained as his life's coach. Don shrugged and rolled his shoulders in a circular motion, tugging on his shirt collar. That was his mental note that a victim was in distress to be pimped on. See, he played on the situation. Don gave CS some manly advice, which he felt applied to all walks of women in the world. CS smiled and dapped Don, feeling a newfound confidence and security to exist. Don's phone rang, and it was his Aunt Laura. "Get over here quick. LaRon is here." LaRon was Don's popular carpenter cousin MJ talked so highly of back at the prison camp. Don asked CS to give him a ride to his aunt's house down the road. CS dropped Don off and drove off to his apartment. Don entered his Aunt Laura's house, and his cousin LaRon greeted him with a wide-open hug. "Hey, Beau, how have you been?" LaRon said. Don was ecstatic, and the two walked off to the den to talk. MJ was right. LaRon was Chapel Hill's #1 carpenter. LaRon made a great name for himself in the town of Chapel Hill. He renovated and rebuilt a lot of houses on Franklin Street, Chapel Hill's historic Main Street that ran throughout the middle of the town. LaRon was always an in-and-out person. He wouldn't stick around for long. He shook hands with Don and jumped the engine to Big Whitey, his old commercial van, and told Don to give him a call next week, and they will hook up and take it from there. Don waved as LaRon drove away, with visions of relocating to Chapel Hill to see what the hoopla and hype was all about that MJ constantly talked about in prison. Sipping coffee at the kitchen table, reading the want ads section of the Durham Herald, Don noticed that a frat house in Chapel Hill was looking for a kitchen steward. Immediately, Don called and landed an opportunity to be interviewed. Quickly, Don caught the South Point Chapel Hill bus, which rode along Highway 54 to Orange County. Reaching the outskirts of Chapel Hill's city limits, Don signaled the driver that he had reached his stop. Walking alongside a serene golf course, which its picket fence seemed to run endless down a long road, Don passed a row of frat and sorority houses, looking for that matched the address on the paper he had in his hand. Finally, reaching the last house, which sat directly across from the golf course on a half-moon driveway, read Kappa Phi Kappa. The huge house was built half brick and half timber medieval style, gave Don a noble, warm feeling as he entered. The place was lavish from wall to wall, with black and white photographs from the 1960s, bearing rugby tournament, yearbook, and fraternity class men photos. Two young men entered the living room with a list of questions in hand. They had introduced themselves and asked Don to come on a floating tour around the house as they walked and interviewed him on site. Don remained on the main floor as he saw staircases and private entrances and exits leading to different areas of the house. Don felt confident and shook hands with the young men, thanked them for their time and the opportunity to serve them, and stepped out into the courtyard to call his cousin LaRon. Don figured since he was already in Chapel Hill, why not give LaRon a call? LaRon picked up. "What's up, Beau?" Don told LaRon where he was located, and LaRon was on his way to scoop Don. In minutes, LaRon picked up Don. Gospel music blasted from the dashboard of Big Whitey as LaRon moved in harmony through the daytime collegiate traffic up Franklin Street. LaRon pulled up into the driveway of a modern prairie-style home with huge glass windows. LaRon walked up, inserted a key, and opened the front door as Don followed behind. Inside were tools, paint, mud, saws, and materials of all kinds. LaRon showed Don around the house. "This is one of my projects. God is good all the time." LaRon was an old drug dealer who did a quick bit in jail decades ago. He was now a passive alcohol-drinking converted Christian who picked up the carpentry trade, seconded by some local alcoholics he used to hang out with when he was released from jail. Since then, LaRon raised his 4 daughters single-handed and was known around Chapel Hill by the residents and law enforcement as the man with 4 little girls and a ladder. That was the reason for LaRon incognito persona he developed over the years. Don just nodded his head, and all he could see was dollar signs. LaRon drove Don back to his mother's house, Aunt Laura, and dropped him off. "Until next time, Beau, Don shook Laurent's hand and wished him a good night, thanking him for the great time showing him what it was he exactly did for a living. MJ was right, Don thought to himself as he went inside to lay down for the night. Winter was not considerate, as storms reigned over the next couple of months. Don made several trips to the Department of Motor Vehicles to obtain some form of government ID, since his license was revoked 7 years ago. The system got tighter, and there was a new process in place to even receive a standard ID. Don completed the list and was approved for his non-driver's ID. Cool, he thought to himself. Now he could move around, and that was the plan to go visit his mother up north. Don still had legal terms and conditions residing over his head that were unleashed by several states. Don's father was an old dope fiend, and he always used to say, the more states you commit crimes in, when you get caught, they will bring you back to all of them and serve you time in those states. Think about what you're doing, boy. He heard his father's voice playing over and over in his head when the thought of parole popped up. The day of Don's release was on New Year's Eve, the night as the ball dropped on national television. He was commanded to report back to the state of West Virginia as soon as he was released from the minimum custody prison camp in Carolina. Don didn't have any relatives or siblings in the West Virginia he could parole to, so that idea didn't sit well with him. There was a constant fight between the two states, Carolina and West Virginia, over Don's physical custody status. Don looked at the bickering as a fight over money and slavery. It was all a slave trade fight going on in his eyes. At times, Don would dive into a deep political thought about his conditional releases status, which would spiral into unpleasant outcomes. Don just kept his faith intact and allowed the two states to figure it out. In the meantime of the confusion, Don decided to grab Greyhound ticket and head up north to see his parents he has not seen in years. Staring through the huge square bus windows at the cars moving in and out lanes, Don played a mental game of charades with himself. Which car do you think has drugs in it? Do you think the police could tell you to look at the car as it drives down the road? He would ask himself, daydreaming about his past in the life he would recall, living majorly with a ton of money, pretty women, fast cars, designer clothes, and luxury homes he once embraced. After 16 hours of bus stops and tolls, Don finally reached the Port of Authority in New York City. Feeling out of place and at home at the same time, Don had slipped into the subway system. So many people, so much movement, as Don slowly began to ease back into his old self, at the same time catching himself, reminding himself that he's a different man now, with years of parole and a condition release, with a remaining 25-year sentence hanging over his head. Thoughts of being careful, moving as a thief in the night, a ninja like a Navy SEAL or federal agent, is all Don could think to move like. Don knew he had to move fast, see his parents and several friends and females of the past, and quickly get out of the city. Don exited the train at 116th Street, one of his notorious drug-peddling Harlem neighborhood blocks. As soon as his head cleared the sidewalk as he walked up the stairs, he saw crowds of young men running back and forth across Lexington Avenue, committing hand-to-hand drug sales. The daily drugstore was open as usual, and nothing changed in Don's eyes. As Don approached the corner, standing in the doorway of the corner bodega's entrance was P.A., one of his old hustling partners. P.A. was a block controller, a boss responsible for 85% of the racket and mayhem going on in the 115th Street block. Don was P.A.'s partner once upon a time ago. Separated by money-making idea differences, Don decided to go his own way. P.A. gave Don a hug. "Welcome back, my brother, to the block. I thought the crackers finished you down south," and slipped $2,000 into Don's coat pocket. P.A. was a heavy marijuana smoker, and that wasn't Don's stick, so that was the perfect time to exit the unplanned meetup. Don wasn't about the hustling or drug peddling scene anymore. He had learned the pimp game while on his prison stint. It was more lucrative and less harmless, being that it was all mental. So, finessing P.A. was as easy as stealing candy from a baby. P.A. had an ego big as the globe, which made it easy for Don to lay down some game. The wind blew, and that was Don's signal to vacate the area. And he constantly reminded himself each and every minute in P.A.'s presence there would be a great chance he was being recorded by a task force of some sort. PA covered the tight-rolled blunt hanging off the edge of his crusty lips with his big mitt hands, known for his rare boxing skills, and struck his lighter as the fierce flames scorched the tip. PA inhaled and nodded his head slowly, full of ego, exhaled and said, "See you later, my nigger. Call me later." He snapped out the blunt ritual and went back to work, shouting at his young group of drug salesmen, "Hit them right there, coming out of the store," meaning, grab that salesperson walking out of the candy store and serve them fast and get the money. Don flagged down a cab and went further uptown to the Bronx. Don knocked on his mother's door as he heard her shout, "Who is it?" Don said, "It's me, Mommy." Don walked in as the door opened, and his mother hugged him tightly. She whispered repeatedly in his ear, my baby, thank God you're all right." Don heard the sound of a pair of slippers scraping the floor coming down the hallway. It was Don's dad. "Hey, Slick, I see you made it back home. Good to see you." Don shook his father's hand and just smiled after all they've both been through in the past. "In the life." His father just nodded, giving Don a sign that their secrets will always remain just that, a secret, as he walked into the kitchen to make him a cup of coffee. Don's mother and him sat and conversed for hours about the past, as she expressed her fear of what the future may behold for Don. He reassured her that she had nothing to worry about. His mother moved on to talking about his Cuban ex-girlfriend, Diane, a long jet black-haired voluptuous 5'5" stallion with small pretty feet. Don's mother talked about how Diane would come visit and check up on her since he was gone, and how their relationship grew solid over the years. Speaking of the devil, Diane had called Don, interrupting the conversation. Don answered, "Baby, I'm outside, come on." Diane was parked out front of Don's mother's building in the front parking lot, ready to show off her new cranberry BMW coupe. Don kissed his mom on the cheek and promised her he would be safe, and he would leave the city immediately to not get caught out of bounds with the West Virginia and North Carolina parole boards. Don's mother slowly shut her apartment's door as her eyes began to fill up with water, as she prayed, humbling under her breath for Don's protection and safety. Don said, "I'm all right, Mommy," and left the corridor, heading out to the street. Don approached the ultra-shiny cranberry BMW coupe and slipped into the front passenger seat. Diane immediately gave him a kiss on his cheek as she pulled out to Bruckner Boulevard, heading to the Cross Bronx Expressway, New Jersey bound. In the life, all big shelters and dealers who wanted to keep a low-profile lifestyle lived out of the city. Many moved to the outskirts, upstate, some hid in the rural areas of the counties, or lived in New Jersey like Diane, a neighboring state under a different set of laws. Diane and Don shot across the George Washington Bridge, heading toward 95 South, Bergen County. The cockpit was quiet as Diane turned up the music, giving Don a taste of the new songs he had missed on lockdown. Diane and Don were always at odds, but she loved the ground he walked on. Diane was a cougar who took pleasure and pride in showing Don the game, although Don was a wrecking ball to deal with, which turned her on. She visited Don in hopes of him paroling to a place she was willing to lease in Charleston, West Virginia. Don denied the idea, and his mind was set on heading further south to North Carolina, his second home, where the food and the southern women were ideal in his eyes. Don had lost his appetite and patience for the northern woman. Diane pulled up to Tower Records and purchased all the latest hip-hop CDs for Don. He just listened to each disc by the seconds. Don had an ear for good talent and music. After listening to 5 full discs, zipping through song after song, he was ready to grab a bite to eat. Diane insisted she make a home-cooked Cuban dish for him as he relaxed. She explained to him he needed to relax after the whirlwind of his past. Don took her up on his offer as he kicked his shoes off and sat back deeply into the sofa. Reminiscing about the good times with Diane was just like this. Good food lingering throughout the house, music playing with the candles lit. That was total peace to Don's spirit. Diane reappeared wearing a pink biking underwear set as she poured Don a glass of wine. She grabbed the clicker to the television and went to BET. Don's phone rang and it was PA. "What's up, man? Are you still in the city? Are you good?" As he asked Don a series of questions, Don replied, Yeah, I'm with my old bitch Diane. PA remembered her from the past, yet wished he could have nabbed her while Don was gone. Everyone in the life knew Diane was an asset of beauty and knowledge to have in their corner. Don ended the conversation short. He kept in mind that PA's phone might have been tapped. He knew PA felt that he had some lead way to keep tabs on him since he gave him that money. Dinner was served, some Cuban steak, rice and beans, and sweet bananas with rum. Afterwards, Don had slipped into Diane's silk sheets, and they sexed the night away. Morning came, and Diane was up cooking breakfast in her birthday suit. Her firm big brown round arched ass and long jet black silky hair is all Don could see from the bedroom. Don already knew how Diane played. She loved hard. He couldn't get any more comfortable, and he knew he had to make a move before he would lose his freedom again to be careless. Don turned over to grab his phone to make a call and saw a stack of rubber-banded cash sitting on the night table next to his empty glass of Cuban rum. "My baby," as Don said silently under his breath. He called up his old cab service buddy, a number Don remembered by heart. Number 48, an old Jamaican driver. Don's friend saved his ass many times in the life. The line opened and 48 answered, "Whop him sty." He heard Don's voice and he shouted with glee, "Me boy is back!" Don told 48 he needed a ride back to North Carolina immediately and gave him Diane's address. 48 told Don he would see him in an hour, ready to hit the road. Don hung up and walked up behind Diane, squeezing and hugging on her soft, voluptuous physique. He laid a line of soft, wet kisses down her neck as she flicked him off so she could perfect her grandma's pancake recipe. They sat and ate, and with the hospitality Diane performed over the past 24 hours, she hoped it was enough to impress and convince Don to stay with her in New Jersey and get back in the life and do what she knew he did best, hustle. Don showered fast as Diane got dressed, slipping her ass tightly into some designer jeans and boots. She grabbed her mink coat and car keys and asked Don if he was ready for her to take him back to New York. Don had got dressed as well, and he told her that it wouldn't be necessary. He had 48 downstairs waiting for him. Diane just sighed. "Slick nigger," rolled softly off her plump, tender lips as she smiled, with her body expressing why she had been so in love with Don for over a decade now. Don gave Diane a hug and a kiss, rubbed on her ass for one last time. She never knew she would never ever see Don again. Don waved farewell as he slipped into a new, dark gray Lexus sedan and disappeared. The next day, the Lexus pulled up to Aunt Laura's house. Don entered as like clockwork. Aunt Laura was cooking that pork sausage and grits breakfast. Nikki saw Don get out of the Lexus and saw the New York tags, and she asked Don if she could use 48 to ride by to New York. She had some unfinished business she needed to handle up top. Don said, "Sure, let me call him back real fast." 48 did a U-turn and returned back to the house to pick up Nikki to head back to New York. Aunt Laura informed Don to contact his cousin LaRon and how he's been calling looking for Don to help him with his carpentry company. It was busy season, house season in Chapel Hill. LaRon needed a foreman to oversee his day-to-day operations. Don called CS to check on his whereabouts. CS was up working a Northern Grill, as usual. He told Don he finalized his breakup with his girl Sarah, and his parents had given him their country home in the north section of Durham. Don promised to meet up with CS in the upcoming days ahead and pulled a piece of paper out of his wallet with a sloppy handwritten number on it that read the name Tierra. Don called the big back square pants physique female he met a while back at the mall. She answered her phone excitedly as if it was her birthday. Don told her to meet him at Northern Grill and gave her the address. Don grabbed his jacket and headed out the door with opportunity in mind of advancing his new anti-crime budding life. Tierra pulled up, and Don greeted her with open arms and introduced her to CS. She didn't care for white people, which came clear right away to Don and CS. Tierra was a North Carolina Central University major from a little flat land town outside of Little Washington, a tiny town located by the water at the coast. That area was saturated with slavery, segregation, and poverty, so tolerating white folks was avoided by any means necessary. Tierra ordered a beer and sipped away, ignoring CS, until he got the silent message to disappear, right after serving her and Dawn their drinks and appetizers. Dawn noticed that Tierra had a little mustache as she licked away the foamy suds of beer from the tip of her lips. Dawn macked Tierra, and his thoughts overall was as if he was closing an intriguing deal. He left Northern Grill with Tierra as she drove back to her collegiate apartment in the north section of Durham, directly off Interstate 85 South. The apartment complex resembled a prison with tier-style apartment doors and each and every level. It was like an upscale motel where one entered the apartment from outside. Tierra and Dawn reached the third-level floor and entered the apartment. It was as basic as one could get, with cheap carpet and furniture to match. Everything matched as if the place was a ran-down cabin. In Dawn's mind, it was better than a prison cell or dormitory, so he sat down and kicked back and closed his eyes with her laying across his lap. Dawn woke up and Tierra was nowhere to be found. He noticed a letter Tierra had left behind that read, "Bae, in the fridge there's a plate of breakfast already cooked for you and some cosmetics in the bathroom for you as well. There's a toothbrush, lotion, and in the bedroom there's a towel and face cloth for you to bathe with. The car keys are on the kitchen counter and the car is parked in space number 23. Have a nice day. Love you, Bae Tierra." And just like that, Dawn's confidence shot through the roof. That introduction had beat out every advance his ex-cougar Diane ever attempted, minus the beauty. Dawn was sold on his decision never to return to his past. Dawn received a phone call from the Kappa Phi Kappa fraternity. They made their final pick and decision to hire him. Dawn was asked to appear at the fraternity house by the golf course by noon. Dawn ate the applewood bacon, eggs, and fried apples and headed out the door. Tierra had an early morning class as she came down on her political science degree. She had one more spin and she would be crossing the stage. She was all about school, men, and her girlfriends from Atlanta, who she was heavily influenced by, being that she was a tiny town country girl. Hoeing was just an understatement to Tierra and her girls. Dawn drove to Chapel Hill, smiling at God shining down on him, excited to see what the future beholds, listening to his inner voice telling him to keep going. To be continued.